At 0452 hours on October 23, 1942, deep within the British Eighth Army's deployment zone near El Alamein, Sergeant John O'Rourke of the Royal Engineers crouched beside a canvas-wrapped frame in the pre-dawn cold. The wind carried fine sand across the depression, a dry scraping sound that matched his rasping breath. Intelligence reports indicated Axis reconnaissance would begin at first light. His unit had 48 hours to complete the deception. The tanks weren't steel. They were rubberized canvas stretched over pneumatic frames, designed by film set engineers in London. But wireless intercepts later confirmed they achieved their purpose. Rommel's intelligence staff estimated British armour strength at nearly double its actual count. O'Rourke's hands worked the inflation valve as the first dummy Sherman took shape against the starfield. He wondered how long credibility could be manufactured from canvas and compressed air. By late August 1942, the British Eighth Army occupied defensive positions stretching 90 kilometres from the Mediterranean coast to the Qattara Depression. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery had assumed command on August 13th, inheriting a force depleted by summer retreats and facing Rommel's Africa Corps at numerical parity. The official war diary recorded 252 operational tanks against estimated Axis strength of 280 German and 278 Italian armoured vehicles. Montgomery's operational directive, dated September 3rd, specified deception as critical to his planned offensive at El Alamein. Sergeant O'Rourke stood in the equipment compound as Corporal Williams and Private Davies unrolled the first prototype dummy tank. The canvas smelled of waterproofing compound and fresh paint. It lay flat on the sand, like a deflated dirigible, 30 feet of olive drab fabric stenciled with markings matching the 7th Armoured Division. The inflation manual, printed on foolscap at the Camouflage Development and Training Centre in Farnham, specified 12 minutes from valve connection to full deployment. Williams connected the compressor line while O'Rourke checked the anchor stakes. The device was absurd in its simplicity, a collapsible frame with pneumatic bladders, weighing roughly 1/20th of an actual tank. Yet aerial reconnaissance photographs from similar operations in Malta had proven effective at distances exceeding 800 yards. The compressor coughed to life and the canvas began to swell. "She's holding pressure, Sergeant," Williams reported, consulting the gauge. The dummy rose slowly, its turret taking shape as internal baffles directed airflow. Within 14 minutes it stood complete, a reasonably convincing representation of a Grant medium tank when viewed from altitude or distance. O'Rourke walked a 50-yard circuit, studying the silhouette against the horizon. From ground level, the deception remained obvious. The tracks were painted canvas, the gun barrel a wooden dowel. But through binoculars, at reconnaissance, altitude, it might pass inspection during the brief seconds of a high-speed overflight. The entire operation depended on that margin of credibility. The September heat climbed past 95 degrees by mid-morning. O'Rourke's orders specified deployment of 62 dummy tanks across a 5-mile front, simulating 2 armoured regiments positioned for a northern offensive thrust. The real armour would concentrate farther south, concealed beneath camouflage netting and positioned only after nightfall. Timing was calculated to the hour. Complete the dummy deployment by October 20th. Begin actual tank movements. October 22nd. Commence artillery barrage. October 23rd at 21:40 hours. Montgomery's planning directive, distributed September 15th through Corps headquarters, outlined Operation Bertram's deception architecture. The document ran to 37 pages of detail covering dummy installations, wireless traffic patterns, and vehicle movement schedules. Section 4 addressed the inflatable tanks specifically, noting that success required not just visual deception, but coordinated false signals across multiple intelligence channels. O'Rourke sat in the operations tent that evening, studying the deployment map under acetylene lamplight. Major Strangeways of the Tactical Deception Unit had briefed the engineering teams 2 days earlier, emphasizing that German aerial reconnaissance flew regular patterns at dawn and dusk. The dummies needed to appear gradually, simulating normal armor concentration rates to avoid suspicion. "We're not trying to fool them completely," Strangeways had explained, his finger tracing the map. "We're confirming their assumptions. Intelligence suggests they expect our main effort in the north. We're simply reinforcing that expectation with physical evidence." The Major's logic was sound, but O'Rourke understood the fragility. One close inspection, one suspicious intelligence officer, one chance discovery could unravel weeks of preparation. The dummy tanks were tools of suggestion, not barriers. Their effectiveness depended entirely on enemy interpretation. Radio traffic from Division reported that German reconnaissance aircraft, likely Henschel HS-126 observation planes, had completed 3 passes over the sector that afternoon. The dummy installation remained covered during daylight, awaiting nightfall for positioning. O'Rourke checked his watch. 6 hours until deployment began. By 2200 hours, the first trucks rolled toward the forward positions. Each vehicle carried 2 deflated dummy tanks, folded into canvas bundles, roughly the size of a large trunk. The engineering crews worked in near total darkness, guided by hooded torches and whispered commands. Stakes were driven, frames assembled, compressors connected. The inflation process created minimal noise, a low hissing that blended with wind across the sand. O'Rourke supervised the southern deployment line, where 16 dummies would simulate a squadron concentration. The crews worked with practiced efficiency, completing each installation in 18 to 22 minutes. By 03:15 hours, 41 dummies stood in position. From O'Rourke's vantage point on a low ridgeline, they formed a convincing cluster of armor, slightly dispersed as doctrine required for protection against air attack. The operations log recorded completion at 03:47 hours, 17 minutes ahead of schedule. O'Rourke walked the line one final time before dawn, checking anchor points and smoothing canvas where wind had created unnatural wrinkles. The deception was set. First light on September 19th arrived at 06:12 hours with typical desert clarity. O'Rourke watched from a camouflaged observation post as Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft appeared over the northern sector at 06:38, following their established pattern. The Henschel flew at approximately 800 feet altitude, low enough for detailed photography, but too high for effective anti-aircraft engagement. The dummy tanks cast long shadows in the angled sunlight. O'Rourke tracked the aircraft through binoculars, noting its steady course and the camera pod mounted beneath the fuselage. The pilot made no course deviation, suggesting the dummies registered as normal armor deployment. The aircraft completed its pass and turned northeast toward Axis lines. Intelligence assessment arrived via dispatch rider at 14:20 hours. RAF reconnaissance had photographed the German airfield at Quotaifia and confirmed the Henschel's return. The film would require processing and analysis, typically a 6 to 8 hour cycle, meaning German intelligence would review the imagery sometime that evening. Corporal Williams approached O'Rourke's position carrying a water can and the afternoon situation report. "Major Strangeways wants casualty assessment on the dummies," he said. "Wind damage mostly. 3 have partial deflation, 2 have anchor stake failures." O'Rourke nodded. The dummies required constant maintenance. Canvas deteriorated under UV exposure, pneumatic seals developed leaks, and desert winds stressed the anchor systems. Each dummy needed inspection every 12 hours, with repairs conducted during darkness to avoid aerial observation. The maintenance schedule demanded careful coordination. Repair crews couldn't approach the dummies during daylight without revealing the deception. Instead, O'Rourke's engineers constructed maintenance tunnels, shallow trenches covered with camouflage netting that allowed concealed access. The work was tedious and uncomfortable, conducted in cramped spaces under midday heat, but essential to maintaining the illusion. By September 24th, the dummy deployment had expanded to 62 units across 3 concentration areas. War diary entries recorded routine, German reconnaissance overflights continuing at dawn and dusk, suggesting the deception remained credible. Intercepted Axis communications, decoded at Bletchley Park and transmitted via secure channels, indicated that German intelligence assessed British armour strength in the northern sector as significantly reinforced. O'Rourke read the intelligence summary with cautious satisfaction. The dummies were performing their function, but the real test lay ahead. Montgomery's offensive was scheduled for October 23rd, 5 weeks distant. The deception needed to hold for the entire duration, convincing Axis planners that British strength concentrated in the north, while actual armour massed covertly in the south. The wind picked up that evening, gusting to 30 knots. O'Rourke dispatched repair crews to reinforce anchor points across all 3 dummy concentrations. By early October, Operation Bertram had expanded beyond the inflatable tanks to encompass elaborate deception across multiple domains. War diary entries from 8th Army headquarters recorded the construction of a dummy supply depot near Tel El Asa, complete with false fuel pipelines fabricated from empty 4-gallon tins painted to resemble steel piping. The installation stretched 200 yards and was designed to suggest logistical preparation for a northern offensive. O'Rourke's engineering section received additional responsibilities as the operation matured. Beyond maintaining the dummy tanks, his crews now constructed false artillery positions using timber frameworks covered with painted canvas. Each fake gun emplacement included track marks, scattered ammunition crates, and even simulated personnel movement achieved by dragging sand to create footpath patterns. The technical challenge intensified as October's heat continued. Temperatures reached 102 degrees by midday, accelerating canvas deterioration and causing pneumatic seals to fail more frequently. Maintenance logs showed dummy tank repairs increasing from twice weekly to daily interventions. Williams developed a repair protocol using bicycle tyre patch kits and rubber cement, completing field repairs in darkness without deflating the entire structure. German reconnaissance flights continued their pattern, now augmented by higher altitude photographic runs at 12,000 feet. RAF intelligence analysed captured Luftwaffe imagery and confirmed the Germans were photographing dummy positions alongside real installations. The deception's success depended on this equivalence. The false targets needed to appear as mundane and routine as genuine military infrastructure. On October 8th, a windstorm with gusts exceeding 40 knots struck the northern sector. O'Rourke received urgent reports at 0340 hours. 11 dummy tanks had broken anchor moorings, and 3 had suffered catastrophic deflation. Repair crews deployed immediately, working through pre-dawn darkness to restore the installation before sunrise reconnaissance. The damage assessment revealed structural weaknesses in the anchor system. O'Rourke's solution was pragmatic. Double stake each corner mounting point and add lateral guy lines using communications wire salvaged from abandoned Italian positions. The modifications required 3 nights to implement across all 62 dummies, but subsequent wind events caused minimal damage. Intelligence summaries dated October 12th indicated that Axis forces were repositioning reserves northward, consistent with expectations of a British offensive in that sector. The dummy concentrations had achieved their strategic purpose, shaping enemy deployments by reinforcing false assumptions. Yet the deception remained fragile. Any close ground inspection would reveal the fabrication instantly. O'Rourke stood beside one of the dummies on the night of October 14th, checking tension on the new guy lines. The canvas surface felt warm from the day's heat, radiating stored energy into the cool night air. 9 days remained until Montgomery's offensive. The dummies needed to survive that duration while the real armour moved into position under strict concealment protocols. The actual armour concentration began on October 18th under Operation Bertram's most critical phase. War plans specified moving 300 tanks and 1,000 vehicles into southern positions while maintaining the appearance of static deployment. The solution employed sun shields, collapsible frameworks that disguised tanks as supply trucks. During daylight, armour remained hidden under these structures. After dark, the sun shields were moved to cover dummy trucks while the real tanks deployed to attack positions. O'Rourke observed this phase from an operational distance. His dummy tanks remained in the northern sector, continuing their role as fixed decoys while engineering resources shifted to supporting the actual armour movement. However, on October 19th, new orders arrived. Construct additional dummy concentrations in the south to simulate the supply vehicles that real tanks had vacated. The assignment required improvisation. Unlike the purpose-built inflatable tanks, these new dummies needed to represent soft-skinned vehicles, trucks, fuel bowsers, and supply lorries. O'Rourke's crews fabricated frameworks from salvaged timber and covered them with painted canvas, creating recognizable vehicle silhouettes that would pass aerial inspection. Technical specifications were less critical for these dummies. Trucks lacked the distinctive geometry of tanks, making them easier to simulate but also less scrutinized by enemy intelligence. O'Rourke's teams completed 43 dummy vehicles in 3 nights, positioning them in dispersal patterns matching standard supply depot layouts. Meanwhile, the inflatable tanks continued their silent duty. Maintenance logs from October 20th recorded increasing canvas fatigue, with several dummies showing stress fractures at frame attachment points. Williams and his repair crews patched the damage using materials from a dummy that had suffered irreparable failure, cannibalizing its fabric to extend the life of others. German reconnaissance activity intensified during this period. Luftwaffe flights increased to 4 passes daily, alternating between low-altitude visual observation and high-altitude photography. RAF analysis suggested German intelligence was conducting final assessments before Rommel's expected defensive dispositions. On October 23rd, a Messerschmitt Bf-110 reconnaissance aircraft flew unusually low over the northern dummy concentration, descending to approximately 400 feet. O'Rourke watched through binoculars as the aircraft made 2 passes, clearly studying the installation with greater scrutiny than previous flights. For 90 seconds, the entire deception hung on the question of whether the pilot would recognize the dummies as fabrications. The Bf-110 completed its passes and departed without deviation, climbing back to altitude and resuming its standard route. Intelligence assessment later that day confirmed no change in German force dispositions, suggesting the close observation had not compromised the deception. But the incident underscored the operation's vulnerability. 48 hours remained until H-hour. The dummies needed to survive only 2 more days. The night of October 22nd brought the operation's most complex movements. Under Montgomery's directive, real armour units completed their final repositioning into southern attack sectors. Simultaneously, O'Rourke's engineers executed the last phase of deception, maintaining dummy activity in the north while actual forces concentrated elsewhere. War diary entries recorded this as maximum concealment phase. All vehicle movements occurred between 2100 and 0400 hours, with strict wireless silence and no visible lights. The desert became a landscape of shadows and whispered commands, hundreds of tanks and vehicles threading through marked routes to their assault positions. O'Rourke's section maintained presence in the northern sector, ensuring the dummy tanks appeared as an active, occupied concentration. Crews moved among the installations carrying hooded torches, creating minimal light signatures that simulated routine maintenance and guard activities. It was theatre designed for distant observation, activity patterns that would register on German listening posts, and night observation equipment as normal military presence. At 02:30 hours, a runner brought orders from division, prepare for artillery commencement in 19 hours. The message was purely informational. O'Rourke's deception mission continued unchanged, but it marked the transition from preparation to execution. The dummy tanks had completed their strategic function. Now they would serve as decoys during the actual battle, drawing attention and possibly fire while real armor struck elsewhere. The pre-dawn hours of October 23rd were unusually quiet. Wind had diminished to near calm, and the desert cold settled into O'Rourke's bones as he conducted final inspections. 59 of the original 62 dummy tanks remained operational, a survival rate exceeding original estimates. The 3 failures had been quietly dismantled and their materials distributed among the survivors. At 0600 hours, German reconnaissance appeared on schedule. The Henschel flew its standard pattern, photographing British positions with routine precision. O'Rourke watched the aircraft complete its pass, knowing this was likely the final observation before battle commenced. Would German intelligence note anything unusual? Would they detect the massive armor concentration developing in the south? Intelligence summaries arrived at 1400 hours. Decrypted Axis communications indicated Rommel's headquarters continued to assess British strength as concentrated in the northern sector, with estimated armor disposition matching the dummy concentrations almost exactly. The deception had succeeded. German reserves and anti-tank units were positioned to counter an offensive that would not occur in the sectors they defended. O'Rourke read the summary twice, absorbing its implications. The inflatable tanks, absurd contraptions of canvas and compressed air, had influenced enemy strategy at the highest level. Their existence had shaped how Rommel's commanders interpreted intelligence, allocated resources, and prepared defences. At 2140 hours, Montgomery's artillery began firing. The desert erupted in thunder. The artillery bombardment involved 882 guns firing along a 20-mile front, delivering 529,000 shells in the first 5.5 hours. The sound was continuous and overwhelming, a physical pressure that compressed the air and numbed thought. O'Rourke's position in the northern sector placed him miles from the actual offensive, but the noise carried across the entire battlefield. German counter-battery fire responded within minutes, concentrating on identified British gun positions. By 2300 hours, Axis artillery was also targeting the northern sector, where O'Rourke's dummy tanks maintained their silent vigil. The first salvo landed 400 yards north of the dummy concentration, raising fountains of sand and rock fragments that pattered down like hail. "They're ranging us," Williams observed, crouched beside O'Rourke in their sandbagged observation post. "Think they'll waste ammunition on the dummies?" O'Rourke didn't answer immediately. If German artillery expended shells destroying fake tanks, those rounds weren't falling on real positions, But he also recognized that his crews occupied the same sector as the dummies, sharing the danger of being targets in a deception operation. The bombardment continued through the night. German fire walked across the northern sector in methodical patterns, searching for concentrations and supply points. At 01:20 hours on October 24th, a salvo landed directly among the eastern dummy cluster. O'Rourke watched through binoculars as 6 explosions blossomed in rapid sequence. When the smoke cleared, 3 dummy tanks were destroyed, shredded canvas hanging from twisted frames. The damage was operationally irrelevant. The real offensive had already begun miles to the south, where the 8th Army's actual armour was engaging Axis defensive lines, but O'Rourke felt an unexpected melancholy watching the dummies disintegrate. They had performed exactly as designed, absorbing attention and fire that might otherwise have fallen on genuine forces. By dawn on October 24th, the Battle of El Alamein had entered its second phase. Radio traffic indicated British forces had achieved breakthrough in the southern sector, penetrating German minefields and engaging panzer reserves. Rommel's forces, initially positioned to counter a northern offensive, were redeploying south in urgent response. Intelligence assessments later confirmed that the dummy tanks had contributed to this initial confusion. German situation maps from October 23rd, captured after the battle, showed British armour strength assessed as heavily concentrated in the northern sector, precisely where the dummies had stood. Rommel's operational orders, issued at 2300 hours on October 23rd, directed 21st Panzer Division to defensive positions protecting against northern breakthrough rather than reinforcing the south, where actual combat developed. The deception's strategic value could be measured in those hours of German uncertainty, the time required for Axis commanders to recognize where the real offensive threatened. In desert warfare, such time translated directly to tactical advantage. Over the following days, the Battle of El Alamein evolved into attritional combat that bore little resemblance to the deception operations that had preceded it. German forces contested every mile of advance, while British armour ground forward through minefields and prepared defences. The northern sector, where O'Rourke's dummy tanks stood, became a secondary front, periodically shelled, but largely bypassed by major operations. By October 26th, 21 of the original 59 operational dummy tanks had been destroyed by artillery fire. The remainder stood in varying states of damage, canvas torn and frames bent, but still recognizable as tank-shaped objects from aerial observation. German reconnaissance continued photographing the sector, suggesting Axis intelligence remained uncertain about actual British force dispositions. O'Rourke's engineering section received new orders on October 27th. Maintain the dummy installation as long as tactically feasible. Division wanted the deception to persist, continuing to fix German attention and resources on defending against threats that didn't exist. It was an extension of the original mission, prolonging uncertainty in enemy planning. The tactical situation deteriorated on October 28th, when German artillery began using airburst shells over the dummy concentration. These rounds exploded above ground level, scattering fragments downward in patterns designed to neutralize personnel in open positions. O'Rourke recognized the threat immediately and ordered his maintenance crews withdrawn to safer positions. The dummies would have to endure without human intervention. War diary entries from October 29th recorded that Rommel had begun withdrawing forces from the northern sector, redeploying them to contain British advances in the south. This represented final confirmation that the deception had succeeded. The Germans had committed reserves to defending against an offensive Axis that never materialized, leaving them weakened where actual combat occurred. On November 2nd, British forces achieved decisive breakthrough in the southern sector. Montgomery's situation report assessed that Axis defensive coherence had collapsed, with German and Italian units retreating westward under intense pressure. The Battle of El Alamein was effectively decided, though fighting would continue for several more days. O'Rourke received orders to abandon the northern dummy installation on November 3rd. His section withdrew quietly, leaving the damaged frames standing on the sand like industrial sculpture, monuments to a successful deception that few would ever understand or acknowledge. The engineering crews assembled at a collection point 15 miles east, where they would await reassignment. As O'Rourke's truck departed the sector, he looked back at the dummy tanks silhouetted against the morning sky. They had survived 5 weeks of exposure, wind, heat, and artillery fire. They had shaped enemy decision-making at the strategic level, and now they would simply be left behind, their canvas degenerating under desert sun until they became indistinguishable from the debris of war that littered every battlefield. The broader outcome of El Alamein became clear through casualty reports and intelligence assessments compiled in November. Axis forces had suffered approximately 30,000 casualties, lost 500 tanks and 400 artillery pieces, and surrendered 30,000 prisoners. British casualties totaled 3,500, with 500 tanks damaged or destroyed. But the strategic significance transcended these numbers. Rommel's Afrika Korps would never again threaten Egypt, and Allied forces had achieved their first major land victory against German forces. The role of Operation Bertram in this outcome remained classified for years after the war. Official histories mentioned deception operations in passing, but detailed accounts of the dummy tanks and associated stratagems weren't declassified until the 1970s. When historians finally examined the operation's documentation, they found evidence of influence at multiple levels. German intelligence reports from October 1942, captured at war's end, showed consistent overestimation of British armour strength in the northern sector. One assessment, dated October 20th, placed British tank numbers at 350 in the north versus 200 in the south, nearly the inverse of actual disposition. This misassessment directly influenced Rommel's defensive arrangements, concentrating anti-tank resources where they would be least effective. O'Rourke's engineering section was reassigned to 8th Army's advance units on November 8th, tasked with clearing routes and repairing infrastructure as British forces pursued retreating Axis units westward across Libya. The work was unglamorous but essential, filling craters, defusing mines, and restoring water points along the coastal road. On November 15th, while supervising road repairs near Tobruk, O'Rourke encountered Major Strangeways, the deception operations officer who had briefed the dummy tank crews in September. Strangeways was travelling west to establish forward deception units for the continuing campaign. "Your inflatable tanks performed admirably, Sergeant," Strangeways said during their brief conversation. Intelligence assessment credits them with at least 72 hours of strategic confusion. In this type of warfare, that duration changes outcomes. O'Rourke nodded, unsure how to respond. The Major's assessment seemed both precisely accurate and somehow inadequate to describe what the operation had achieved. The dummy tanks had been absurd contraptions, yet they had functioned exactly as designed. They had existed at the intersection of industrial production, tactical deception, and human credulity, and they had worked. Strangeways continued. "We're developing similar capabilities for operations in Tunisia, more sophisticated materials, better anchor systems, improved maintenance protocols. The concept proved valid at El Alamein. Now we'll expand and refine it." The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes before Strangeways departed. O'Rourke returned to supervising road repairs, but the Major's words remained with him. The dummy tanks hadn't been a desperate improvisation or a lucky gambit. They had been a calculated application of deception principles, and their success would influence military operations for the remainder of the war. The pursuit across Libya continued through November and into December, with British forces advancing nearly 700 miles to the approaches of Tunisia. O'Rourke's engineering section maintained roads, cleared obstacles, and occasionally encountered the detritus of Axis retreat. Abandoned vehicles, supply dumps, and defensive positions evacuated in haste. On December 3rd, while working near Agadir, O'Rourke discovered an abandoned German intelligence post. The facility had been hastily evacuated, leaving behind documents, maps, and photographic analysis materials. British intelligence teams arrived within hours to collect the materials, but O'Rourke glimpsed some of the reconnaissance photographs spread across a work table. One image showed the northern sector at El Alamein, dated October 22, 1942. The dummy tank concentrations were clearly visible, annotated in German with unit identifications and strength estimates. The intelligence analysts had assessed them as genuine armor, confirming the deception's success at the most fundamental level. Photographic interpretation. This discovery provided O'Rourke with unexpected closure. The dummy tanks had existed in a peculiar operational space where their effectiveness could only be inferred from enemy actions and reactions. Seeing them documented in German intelligence materials confirmed they had achieved their purpose. Not perfectly, perhaps, but adequately for strategic effect. The campaign entered a new phase in January 1943 as British forces linked with American units advancing from the west. Tunisia became a convergence zone where Allied forces from multiple directions compressed Axis forces into an increasingly restricted perimeter. The war in North Africa was approaching its conclusion. O'Rourke's section participated in preparations for the final offensives, conducting engineering work that bore little resemblance to the deception operations of El Alamein, but occasionally rumors circulated about new deception initiatives: dummy gliders before airborne operations, false beaches before amphibious assaults, inflatable vehicles suggesting armor concentrations that didn't exist. The techniques employed at El Alamein had proliferated across multiple theaters. In Sicily, dummy landing craft influenced Axis defensive dispositions. Before D-Day in Normandy, an entire Phantom Army group suggested invasion preparations in southeast England, while actual forces massed elsewhere. The principle remained constant: shape enemy perceptions to create tactical and strategic advantage. On May 13, 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The campaign that had begun with Italian invasion of Egypt in 1940 concluded with total Allied victory. Casualty totals for the entire North African campaign exceeded 500,000 killed, wounded, and captured across all forces: British, Commonwealth, German, Italian, and American. O'Rourke stood at the Tunisian coast that day, looking across the Mediterranean towards Sicily and the next phase of war. The inflatable tanks at El Alamein seemed distant now, both temporally and conceptually, yet they remained relevant as evidence that modern warfare encompassed more than firepower and maneuver. Information, perception, and deception had become weapons as significant as artillery or armor. The official history would record tanks destroyed, miles advanced, and casualties suffered. But the unofficial history, the classified documentation of deception operations, told a parallel story of how wars could be influenced by carefully constructed illusions that shaped enemy decision-making at critical moments. The war continued through 1943, 1944, and into 1945, with O'Rourke's engineering service extending through Sicily, Italy, and eventually northwestern Europe. But El Alamein remained a reference point in his experience, the moment when unconventional approaches had demonstrated genuine military value. In April 1945, with Germany's collapse imminent, O'Rourke found himself in a displaced persons camp in Belgium, supervising infrastructure repairs. Among the camp's administrative staff was a former German intelligence officer who had worked in North Africa, before capture in Tunisia. During a casual conversation, O'Rourke mentioned he had served at El Alamein. The German officer, whose name was recorded only as Hauptmann Fischer in post-war debriefing documents, responded with unexpected specificity. "The October offensive surprised us," Fischer said in serviceable English. "We anticipated the northern sector. Our assessments showed significant armor concentration there. When the actual attack developed in the south, it required hours to understand the real situation." O'Rourke didn't reveal his role in that deception, but Fischer's comments confirmed what intelligence assessments had suggested. The dummy tanks had influenced operational decisions at German headquarters level, creating confusion that persisted through the battle's critical opening phases. Fischer continued, "After the war, I learned about the deception operations, the inflatable tanks, the false supply depots, the dummy installations. It was comprehensive and well executed. Our photographic interpreters saw what they expected to see." This conversation, recorded in O'Rourke's personal journal and later deposited with the Imperial War Museum, provided direct evidence from the German perspective of Operation Bertram's effectiveness. Fischer's acknowledgement that intelligence analysts saw what they expected to see captured the deception's essential mechanism, reinforcing existing assumptions rather than creating entirely new perceptions. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. O'Rourke remained with occupation forces through September before demobilization began. He returned to England in October 1945, 3 years and 2 months after the inflatable tanks had stood in the desert at El Alamein. Post-war analysis of Operation Bertram appeared in classified military studies throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. The Combined Operations Headquarters conducted detailed assessments of deception effectiveness, interviewing participants and reviewing captured German documents. Their conclusions, published in restricted circulation reports, credited tactical deception with contributing significantly to Allied success at El Alamein. Specific assessments varied, but most analyses concluded that Operation Bertram had achieved 3 primary effects. It reinforced German assumptions about British offensive intentions, delayed Axis recognition of the actual attack axis, and influenced resource allocation in ways that weakened German defensive effectiveness. The dummy tanks specifically were credited with creating a false center of gravity that shaped Rommel's defensive dispositions. O'Rourke transitioned to civilian life in 1946, working as a civil engineer in reconstruction projects across Britain. He rarely discussed his wartime service, and when he did, he focused on conventional engineering work, road building, bridge construction, mine clearance. The inflatable tanks remained classified, their story known only to those with security, clearances, and operational need. The first public disclosure of Operation Bertram appeared in 1951, when British military historian Major General J.F.C. Fuller published a brief mention in his analysis of desert warfare. Fuller described dummy installations and false concentrations without technical detail, acknowledging that deception had played a role at El Alamein. More comprehensive accounts emerged in the 1970s as wartime classification expired. The Public Record Office released Operation Bertram's planning documents, after-action reports, and intelligence assessments. Military historians gained access to German archives that confirmed how British deception had influenced Axis intelligence appreciation. O'Rourke was interviewed for an oral history project in 1974, 32 years after El Alamein. The interview transcript, preserved at the Imperial War Museum, recorded his memories of the inflatable tanks with technical precision and emotional restraint. He described the engineering challenges, the maintenance protocols, and the tension of watching German reconnaissance aircraft photograph the installations. "They were absurd things," O'Rourke stated in the interview. "Canvas and compressed air pretending to be 30-ton vehicles, but they worked because the Germans needed to believe in them. They fit the expected pattern, confirmed existing assumptions. That's all deception really is, giving the enemy what they expect to see." The final assessment of Operation Bertram's contribution to Allied victory at El Alamein remains subject to historical debate. Some analysts argue the deception was decisive, creating the confusion necessary for Montgomery's offensive to achieve breakthrough. Others contend that superior British resources and firepower would have prevailed regardless of tactical deception. Documentary evidence supports a middle interpretation. Operation Bertram influenced but did not determine the battle's outcome. The dummy tanks and associated deception measures shaped German defensive preparations in ways that provided British forces with tactical advantages during the offensive's critical opening phases. These advantages, measured in hours of confusion, misallocated resources, and delayed responses, contributed incrementally to operational success. Broader lessons emerged from El Alamein regarding deception warfare. Military doctrine incorporated principles of coordinated deception across multiple intelligence channels: visual, signals, and documentary. The concept of confirming enemy assumptions rather than creating entirely novel perceptions became standard guidance in deception planning. The dummy tanks themselves evolved into more sophisticated systems employed throughout World War II and beyond. By 1944, Allied forces deployed inflatable aircraft, landing craft, and complete vehicle parks. These installations supported operations including the Normandy invasion, where an entire Phantom Army group convinced German intelligence that invasion forces threatened the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy beaches. O'Rourke died in 1982, aged 67. His obituary in the Times mentioned distinguished service with the Royal Engineers in North Africa and Europe without elaborating. His personal papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum by his family, included the journal with his conversation with Hauptmann Fischer and various technical notes about inflatable tank maintenance procedures. The inflatable tanks themselves survived as physical artifacts. Several examples were preserved in military museums, displayed alongside explanatory materials about Operation Bertram. These exhibits typically emphasize the tank's role in the deception that helped win El Alamein, though historians continue debating the precise magnitude of their contribution. The official history notes one final detail. In late October 1942, after British forces had broken through German defences, reconnaissance units discovered that Rommel's headquarters had maintained a situation map showing British armour concentrations in the northern sector, exactly where the dummy tanks had stood. The map remained unchanged for nearly 48 hours after the southern offensive began, suggesting German intelligence continued believing the deception even after evidence contradicted it. In the file, the numbers had already rewritten the war.